Hi, I'm Lili. Today I'm going to show you how I made my miniature car, or at least half the car, that I plan on using on my next stop motion animation. The whole thing is made by hand and from scratch. There's no kit, no 3D printer, no CNC or anything like that. And all the techniques that I'm going to show to you today, you can use them to create the full car. For me, I decided to do only half because the way I plan to frame my next stop motion animation, I knew that I will only see this part, so might as well just create what I need. But hopefully this tutorial can be useful for your own projects, and I hope you enjoy it. To create this project, first I needed some image reference. So I did a Google image search looking for car technical drawings, and you have a bunch of them. What I was going for is some technical drawing that show the same car from different angle. You have usually 3 views, you can have 4 views as well. Side, front, back and top view. It depends the kind of style and type of car you're looking for. The one important thing that I was looking for is dimension. I need to have the one dimension for the whole length and the width. Those are really important to scale the drawing to the appropriate scale for this project. I decided to go for this drawing, which have the 4 view that I was looking for and the dimension. The scale I use all the time is 1/10. 1 centimeter on my scale is 10 centimeter in real life. So this car in particular, the whole length, as you can see, 4854 millimeter, was, let's say, roughly 480 centimeter. So in my 1/10 scale, that means I need to use 48 centimeter on my project. If you use a different scale for your project, take the time to make sure you calculate it properly before starting building it. Then I use my software, Illustrator, to stretch the drawing to the right scale onto my pages. I make sure the dimension in height and length, for example, were accurate on my scale. And I had to place this drawing on multiple sheets of paper because I don't have a fancy printer. I have a very basic A4 printer. So you can start seeing all the sheets of paper lined up. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That means I can print it on all those sheets of paper, cut it and tape it back together. Once I have my drawing on the right scale, I start to get a better understanding of how big it's gonna be. And you see, this is a piece of balsa wood that I wanted to use to build the volume inside the car. And those big pieces of wood, they're not cheap, and I realized I needed quite lots of them. So it's gonna be a very expensive project. It's at that point I realized, you know what, maybe I just need the half of the car. So I made a financial decision on this one. But it made sense because I knew I will mainly see the front of the car for my stop motion animation. So by cutting this big piece of balsa wood in 3 parts and adding more leftover balsa wood on top, I can build all the volume I need. Then I cut out all my template with the X-Acto blade. So I have my top view, side view, I cut out the tires as well, and the front view. I cut all my pieces of balsa wood to the right size, use some wood glue to sandwich them all together. Add more pieces of balsa wood until I was sure I had the right width, and keep adding more pieces, sandwich them and leave them overnight with the clamps on to build up my block. Now, to cut this block to the right design, I needed to use the template for the side view in that case. So I used some spray tack to glue the piece of paper onto the wood. And because there was a bit of an angle, I cut the top part of the drawing and glue it on the top part of my block. Now, to cut this big piece of wood, ideally you will have a bandsaw to do it. I took some bunch of images from the internet just to get you an idea of the right machine to do the job. Those are big and expensive usually, and I don't have any of that. So I thought I'm gonna make it work with what I've got, which in my case is a Japanese saw, which have a blade that is longer than the width of the car. So I thought that's gonna work. So I started very patiently to cut the piece out and realized quickly that it's gonna be more tricky than what I thought. So I started to cut pieces on the side. I used a chisel. It was a bit rougher than what I intended, but you know what? It did the job. Once I have the main part of the volume out, then I can take some leftover wood, longer than the width of the car, wrapped up in a rough sanding paper, and start sanding down. And this was much more efficient to get the shape and to smooth the whole thing up. Now, this is a very rough beginning. You can see there is some gap between the different block of wood that I've glued together. That's fine, that can be filled with some wood filler later on. Next, I took the back of the block and used a different drawing, this time with the front view, then I position in place just so I can get an idea of the volume that I need to remove on either side at the right angle. So I removed it with the saw first and then went back at it with the sanding paper. I did the same with the front of the car around the bumper. This time I flipped the piece of wood upside down, used the top view to just mark out which part I need to remove, and then once again use the saw to remove them and the sanding paper to smooth everything up. I still had a bit of gaps, so I used the wood filler to fill them up, let it dry, and then sand them down. It started to slowly look like a car. Then I had to remove the space around the tires, so first I used a wood knife and went around this line quite a few times, go deeper every time, and then I can remove the interior part with the chisel. Once that part was removed, I can move to the next stage. My car was not directly on the ground, it needs to be lifted because later on you're going to have the tires. So what I did to replace the tire temporarily is to measure this gap, took some piece of leftover wood and then glued them underneath. That means it will be raised from the ground. It will make it easier to work with. I have those two leftover bits at the front, and I also use some balsa wood sheets at the back that I cut to size and I sand all around to match the shape of the car. Now this is a rough base. This is the volume I want in order to build details on top of it. For that I wanted to use polymer clay, and if you use polymer clay directly on balsa wood, it will not attach to it. So what I did is cover the whole thing with aluminium foil and try to keep it as tight as possible. I've used some duct tape underneath the car to make sure the aluminium foil stay in place and it's not moving around. Then I use some super Sculpting, that's the polymer clay I use absolutely all the time. I use the pasta machine to warm it up and to create some nice layers out of it. Then I took my sketch and with a permanent marker started to mark different lines on the bonnet to start to see where I wanted to build up my volume. Then I cut some pieces of polymer clay, placed them on top of it, press them into position and start to blend them in and to smooth the edges. And start to slowly building up more pieces of polymer clay, blend them with each other, smooth and round up the edges. So it's really at that stage that you start to decide the style and design of your car. So it doesn't matter so far if you haven't got something that was exactly as you thought. It's really that stage of the polymer clay they can build up details into it. This project was the first time ever I tackled something like a car. So as you probably have guessed, I'm not someone who is very specialized into car. This was a fun way to play around with different kind of volume and shape. But obviously if you're into cars and if you want to work on a specific design, you can really build it up. It's just about adding layers of polymer clay. Every time you have a sheet of polymer clay, you can really sculpt it, define it in much more details. You can start to add more detail on the side doors. Just overall, you can start to see it start to look like a car. You needed more detail at the front, so I added bumper, I added car plates, all those kind of things. Now in order to work on the next stage, I need this polymer clay to set. So ideally you put it in the oven, but personally I thought I'm going to do a quick cheat. Basically using the heat gun on a lower setting and just go all around it very gently for a few minutes, and then you let it cool down completely. It will not cook it properly and throughout, but it will cook the outside layer, which is all I need. Now to work on the top layer, I've used my favorite thermoplastic Worbla, and I knew I wanted to work it in two parts. First, I wanted one part which include the side doors and the roof, and that needs to be strong enough to be freestanding because the interior is going to be removed. And then I have a front part for the bonnet and the bumper, and that can be used with one layer. So I have cut one layer for the front and I have two layers for the back of the car. I warm it up with a heat gun and warm them at the same time so they're both hot and they can bond to each other. This is important that they are at the same temperature so they can bond correctly, and then you just press them and keep heating them up. So keep them warm, that is really important. And once they're bonded nicely to each other, then I can press them onto my car. At that stage, all I care about really was the side doors and the roof. So I just press it onto the car. I didn't care too much if there was some fold on the front windshield, for example. I was really concerned just about the side and the detail. And for that, you just keep using the heat gun, keep them warm, and use some sculpting tools to shape slowly the details into it. Make sure you go all around the windows to have a clean line. Same for the front of it, I didn't care about the fold, I just wanted to have a clean line all around it. Once I was happy with the shape, I decided to cut the window out. So for that, I warm up the Worbla again and then use the stainless knife to cut them out. Once I was happy with that, I started to work on the front part of the car. First I needed to apply some aluminum foil on either side, because if I apply the front part in Worbla to the previous part already Worbla, it will bond to each other, and I wanted those two parts to be separated. So once I have the aluminum foil in place, I can warm up the big piece of Worbla and press it onto the front of my car, and with my fingers slowly go around every shape, go back and forth with the heat gun until I had a nice shape overall. And then I let it cool down completely. And then I can gently lift the back part of the car and remove it. The front part of the car was a bit harder to remove because you have those Worbla parts that come inwards around the tires, so I needed to be gentle with it to avoid tearing the Worbla. And there you have it, the front part and the back part. Now going back to my wooden base, I wanted to keep the front to be inside of the bonnet of the car. Then I needed to keep the bottom part of the body to just make sure that things hold together. And I needed to have the back of the car to be able to close it and create a back panel. So I used my saw and divided those pieces. So I have my front part, the bottom part, and the back of the car. Then I can use some super glue to reattach them together. Then I place the Worbla part back onto the shape and then try out the back to see if it fits nicely. Then I start to focus on the tire. For that, I drew a disc that was smaller than the final tire, cut the excess out and sand them down. Then I wrap up the balsa wood with some aluminum foil and use the hot glue gun to attach it to a leftover board. Then I cover the whole thing with a sheet of polymer clay, cut the excess out and start shaping it. You can use a metal ruler. I find it really useful to smooth and to flatten all the edges. You can flatten the top, but I think a roller will be even better. And then it's just about using some sculpting tool to slowly create the shape of the tire, of the wheel, and you can easily add more layers. I like to use some containers that are around me just to get a nice round shape, cut them out and add it to my initial volume and just blend it in, adding more layers. And then if you're fancy, you can start to build up much more detail into your rim, into the stoke. I think it's called stoke. I kept at it, going back and forth until I had a nice shape that I was happy with. And then I start to work on the mold to copy it. For that, I've used some cardboard and the hot glue gun and built up a wall around the polymer clay. Looking back, I should have put more space all around it. It was a bit tight. I like to use the mold star because it's really quick to set, less than an hour, and it's not too expensive. So you have to mix the same volume of part A, part B together. First I mix them up in one container properly, then I transfer it to another container, ideally from some heights, so you remove the air bubble and you make sure that it's properly mixed up, and then I can fill my mold and let it set for even less than an hour. Then I can remove the wall, remove my shape, and there you have it, a little mold. Then to fill it up, I use some fast cast resin. FC 120 works absolutely fine. You measure the same volume of part A, part B, mix them up properly together, fill your mold, leave it dry at least 20 minutes or half an hour, remove it and start the same thing again to have your two tires, and then you just need to sand down the excess at the back. Then I put them on the side and start focusing on the interior. For that, I've printed a few images reference just to get an idea of the different volume and shape present inside of the car. And then I use some leftover balsa wood and super glue them together, sand them down, cut them to shape to slowly build up the dashboard, the different component underneath as well. I knew I needed to have some seats, so I took some leftover piece of balsa wood and timber that I found here and there and create a shape that was smaller than the finished product that I wanted. I've attached the pieces together with some screws because the whole thing needs to go to the oven, and I don't want to have super glue going into my oven because that could potentially release some fumes, so I'm not a big fan. I thought let's just attach them with some screws and a bit of wire for the top part of the headrest. And then to apply some polymer clay on top of it, you can use the aluminium foil that I used previously, or you can use an aluminium mesh. And for smaller product, I think aluminium mesh works a bit better. So I just wrapped it and tried to make it as tight as I can, remove the excess and cut it with a scissor and press it tight. And as you can see, it's got a nice fit into my car. Then I used the same polymer clay than before, Super Sculpting, use the pasta machine to create a sheet out of it, and then start to press into the seat and make sure it bonds with the aluminum underneath, and then start to slowly shaping it with my finger first and then some sculpting tools. I wanted to add some texture, so I use a piece of fabric. It's always best to do a test run first to see the kind of texture you're going to create. And then you apply the fabric all around and gently press it with your fingers. It's also a good idea to press it with the sculpting tool if, as you can see here, you need to go a bit deeper into the clay. I obviously repeat the whole process for the other seat, and then I cook both of them for half an hour in the oven. While that was cooking, I went back to my dashboard, start to build up more shapes, start to get into slightly detail here and there. There's an area when you have the speedometer and the fuel gauge meter that I wanted to work with some wobbler, so you just heat it up, press it into it. Once that was in, I decided to cover the whole dashboard with more wobbler. The wobbler I had this time was some beige. It works as well, it's just a bit rougher in terms of texture, so the black wobbler is better for the outside of the car, it's smoother, but for this part I thought that's going to do just fine. And I wrapped up the whole dashboard with it, and when the wobbler is still warm you can sculpt it. So this is where you get your sculpting tools on hand and you start to add lots more detail. I knew for my stop motion animation you will barely see inside of the car, so I wasn't concerned too much about the kind of detail. I just thought, you know what, I'm going to play around, add more shape. Obviously, this is where you can literally spend days going into every single detail at the right scale of the interior of the car. But for me, I just thought I'm going to play around a bit, add the steering wheel, add a few components just to make it look like the interior of the car without obviously going into too much details. I've added the gear lever with some thick wire as well and yet more wobbler. Once I was happy with that, I super glue it to the main body of the car. By then my seats were cooked, so I just positioned them, make sure they were fitting nicely. And then I went back to the other part of wobbler that I used to create the side doors and the roof. Removed the polymer clay that was inside, didn't need it anymore. And start to focus on the door handle. For that I use a bit of wobbler, warm it up and press it around a nail file which just have the nice curve to it. So I let it cool down on the nail file and then I can cut just a tiny piece of it, as you can see, use a bit of super glue and position it onto the door handle, and obviously done it on both sides. Then I press my wobbler back onto the car and realize it's going to need a bit of adjustment here or there to make it a nice fit. I also needed to have some clear panel to create the windows. So I went back to my wooden shape and start cutting some plastic sheet. You can use some clear wobbler or just any kind of plastic will do, and take my time to cut it to the right size and the right shape. And then I put all the glass panel on the side and start painting. First I apply some black gesso to prime everything up, and then start to apply some acrylic paint. Initially I was going for a dark blue with a green undertone for the car, but for whatever reason it ended up going purple. Anyway, I decided to just go on with it. I needed to add a few more components such as the side mirror, so I took a lollipop stick which happened to be just the perfect shape, and I need to cut the other side, round it up with a nail file. And then I use some wobbler first to build up the back of the little wood part to round it up. Then I took a second part of wobbler, warm it up, and then wrapped up the whole mirror all around it. When this was done, then I can joint the excess wobbler on the side and slowly bend it so I can have the side mirror holder. I'm not sure even how you call this part, but anyway, this is how it looks when it's all done and cut. Then the paint was dry, so I can apply a dirty wash throughout, apply some diluted brown acrylic paint and remove the excess with a wet paper towel. And I've done this on every single component of the car, and then spray it with a clear matte varnish inside and gloss varnish outside. Then I start to think about how I'm going to access inside of the car once I superglue the top part in position, and realize maybe the best option would be to actually cut the back panel and make it removable. So that's what I did. I cut it with a saw, removed it, and then position my seat into place. It was better to temporarily place the back panel as well while I superglue those seats. Then I can remove my back panel, work on the windows. For that I used the tiniest bit of super glue all around it. Honestly, use the minimum possible because you're always at risk of having the super glue reacting to the clear plastic and making a white stain. So be very careful and take your time with that stage. And then I've placed my part with the side doors back in position, realizing I need to adjust and force it a bit with super glue just to make sure I have a nice fit. Then I can press my back panel back onto it and add a bit of black gesso just to hide the transition. Then I need to position my wheel. Ideally, you will have a drill bit that is long enough to go all throughout the width of the car, and I didn't have this drill bit, so I thought I'm gonna cheat. So first I used some leftover part of balsa wood to build up the volume so that the wheel is at the right depth, and I super glue it in place, and then I super glue the wheel onto it. I mean, I knew my car wasn't going anywhere anyway, so I thought might as well just cheat, just don't tell anyone. And then I can remove the temporary batten underneath, and there you have it, the car is finished. Thanks for watching the video, I hope you enjoy it. Next time I'm going to show you how to make a miniature modern flat by hand and from scratch as usual. See you next time, take care.